Hi everyone, I'm Amanda, and when my ex-husband's new wife posted photos of herself redecorating my children's bedrooms in what she thought was their house, she had no idea she was about to learn the most expensive lesson of her life. While she was busy choosing new curtains for the master bedroom and hosting dinner parties in my dining room, I was sitting in my lawyer's office, holding the one document that would change everything. The deed to that house was still in my name, and David and Christine were about to discover that some victories aren't as permanent as they seem. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 2 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be living in a cramped downtown loft while watching my ex-husband parade his new life through my old windows, I would have laughed. Not the kind of laugh that comes from finding something funny, but the hollow kind that escapes when reality becomes too absurd to process any other way. But here I was, scrolling through Christine Parker's Instagram account at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, watching her post photos from the kitchen where I used to make Tyler's lunch every morning and help Sophie with her homework every afternoon. The divorce had been brutal, the kind that leaves everyone involved feeling like they've survived a natural disaster. David and I had been married for 14 years, and for the last 5 of those years I'd watched him slowly drift away from me and toward his work at the architectural firm downtown. We'd tried counseling, weekend getaways, date nights that felt more like business meetings, but nothing seemed to bridge the growing distance between us. When he finally asked for the divorce, part of me was almost relieved. The fighting would stop, the tension would end, and maybe we could figure out how to be better parents when we weren't constantly disappointing each other as spouses. What I hadn't expected was Chris. She was younger, obviously, with that polished confidence that comes from never having to choose between paying for groceries and paying for school supply. She worked in marketing for a tech startup, drove a white BMW, and had the kind of social media presence that made everything look effortless and expensive. David had met her at a conference in Seattle 6 months before he asked for the divorce, though he swore nothing had happened between them until after we separated. I believed him then because I wanted to, because the alternative meant that the last year of our marriage had been built on lies I was too tired to uncover. The custody arrangement had been relatively straightforward. Tyler and Sophie would live with me during the week and spend weekends with David. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable, and after months of uncertainty, stable felt like a luxury. David had moved into a sleek apartment in the Pearl District, the kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman who wore a uniform. It suited his new life, his new relationship, his new version of himself that seemed to have no room for the suburban routine we'd built together. For 18 months, this arrangement worked. The kids adjusted better than I'd expected, probably because they'd been living with tension for so long that the calm felt normal. I threw myself into work at the digital marketing agency where I'd been freelancing since Sophie started school. My boss, a sharp woman named Elena who'd built her company from nothing, offered me a full-time position with benefits and a salary that meant I could finally stop worrying about whether the car would make it through another month. My loft apartment was small, but the kids had bunk beds in the single bedroom, and I slept on a pull-out couch in the living room, but we made it work. Tyler decorated his side of the room with basketball posters, Sophie covered hers with drawings of horses, and slowly we started to feel like a family again. Then David announced that he and Christine were getting married. He called me on a Thursday evening while I was helping Sophie with a math worksheet, his voice carrying that careful, neutral tone he'd perfected during our divorce proceedings. They'd had a small ceremony in Christine's hometown in California, he explained, just immediate family. The kids would meet Christine properly this weekend, and he hoped we could all find a way to make this transition smooth for everyone involved. I managed to say congratulations and ask the appropriate questions about their plans, but after I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at Sophie's math homework until the numbers started to blur together. It wasn't that I still loved David, not in the way that made me want him back, but there was something final about remarriage that made our divorce feel complete in a way the legal paperwork hadn't. He wasn't just moving on anymore, he was moving forward, building something new while I was still figuring out how to rebuild what was left. The kids came back from their first weekend with Christine full of stories about her cooking and her dog, a golden retriever named Charlie who apparently knew how to shake hands and roll over. Sophie was particularly enchanted by Christine's jewelry collection and the way she did her makeup, while Tyler seemed impressed that she knew enough about basketball to hold an actual conversation about his favorite team. I listened to their enthusiasm and made the appropriate encouraging noises, but inside I felt something I hadn't experienced since the early days of the divorce: jealousy. Not of Christine's relationship with David, but of how easily she seemed to fit into the space I'd left behind. Over the following months, Christine became a regular fixture in the kids' stories. She helped Tyler with a science project about renewable energy. She taught Sophie how to braid friendship bracelets. She took them to a Timbers game and let them stay up late watching movies on Friday night. David seemed happier than he'd been in years, and even I had to admit that Christine appeared to genuinely care about Tyler and Sophie. She never tried to replace me or overstep boundaries, and when she picked the kids up for David's weekends, she was always polite and respectful, which is why what happened next felt like such a complete betrayal of everything I thought I understood about the life we'd all carefully constructed. It started with a text message from Tyler on a Sunday evening in late October. He was supposed to be at David's apartment, but instead of the usual goodnight message or request for me to help him with homework over the phone, he sent a photo of a bedroom I recognized immediately. It was his old room in our house on Elmwood Drive, the one with the built-in bookshelf David had installed when Tyler was 7 and the window that faced the big maple tree in the backyard. But everything else was different. The walls, which had been painted blue with white trim, were now a sophisticated gray. The furniture was new, modern, expensive-looking. The basketball posters had been replaced with framed prints of vintage sports equipment. The text that followed made my hands shake. "Dad says we're moving back home." Christine redecorated everything. "Do you think it looks cool?" I stared at the message for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Moving back home, our house on Elmwood Drive, the one where Tyler had taken his first steps and Sophie had learned to ride her bike in the driveway. The house where David and I had planned to raise our children and grow old together, where we'd hosted birthday parties and holiday dinners and quiet Sunday mornings that felt like everything I'd ever wanted from life. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Sophie, sending a video tour of what used to be her bedroom. Christine had transformed it into something that looked like it belonged in a design magazine, all soft pastels and carefully coordinated accessories. Sophie's voice in the video was bright with excitement as she showed off the new comforter and the gallery wall of framed art where her crayon drawings used to be taped. "Christine says I can help her decorate the playroom next," Sophie's voice chirped from my phone. "She's really good at making things pretty." I set my phone down and walked to the window of my loft, looking out at the city lights that had become familiar over the past 2 years. Somewhere out there, in the house I still thought of as home, my children were settling into bedrooms that had been erased and rebuilt without my knowledge. David hadn't called to tell me about the move. There had been no discussion, no heads up, no consideration for how this might affect the kids' routine, or my access to them. He'd simply decided that his new wife deserved the house where his old wife used to live, and apparently assumed I would be fine with it. But what David didn't know, what Christine definitely didn't know, and what I'd almost forgotten myself until I was standing at my window that night feeling like my entire past had been stolen from me, was that the deed to that house on Elmwood Drive was still in my name. Not our names, not David's name, but mine alone. It was a detail from before our marriage, back when I was 26 and working at a nonprofit downtown. My grandmother had died and left me a modest inheritance, enough for a down payment on a small house in a neighborhood that was just starting to gentrify. David and I had been dating for 3 years, living together for 1, and talking about marriage in the abstract way people do when they're sure of their future but not quite ready to make it official. When I found the house on Elmwood Drive, with its solid bones and enormous potential, I'd made an offer using my inheritance as the down payment and my salary as qualification for the mortgage. David moved in 6 months later, and we were married the following spring. He contributed to the mortgage payments, helped with renovations, and treated the house like it was ours in every way that mattered. But because I'd bought it before we were married, and because we'd never gotten around to adding his name to the deed, legally speaking, it had always been mine. During the divorce, David's lawyer had argued for his share of the house's equity, and my lawyer had negotiated a settlement. that gave him half the value in other assets rather than forcing a sale. It had seemed fair at the time, a way to keep the house in the family for the kids, while giving David the cash he needed to start over. What we'd all overlooked, apparently, was changing the deed itself. David had been making the mortgage payments as part of our divorce agreement, treating it like child support paid directly to the bank. I'd assumed he understood that he was essentially renting the house from me, that the arrangement was temporary until we could figure out a more permanent solution. Clearly, he'd assumed something very different. Standing at my window that October night, looking out at a city that suddenly felt too small to contain the anger building in my chest, I realized that David and Christine hadn't just moved into my house. They'd moved into my house, redecorated my children's bedrooms, and were probably planning to live there indefinitely, all while assuming I had no say in the matter. They were wrong. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in over a year. Instead of going to the office, I drove across town to a small law firm in the Hawthorne district, where Marcus Thompson had been practicing family law for 20 years. Marcus had handled my divorce, and while David's lawyer had been slick and aggressive, Marcus had been steady and thorough. He was the kind of attorney who read every line of every document and kept detailed files on everything, which was exactly what I needed. His office was in a converted house with creaky floors and windows that needed new weather stripping, the kind of place that felt more like visiting a favorite uncle than consulting with a lawyer. Marcus greeted me with the same calm smile he'd worn through every tense moment of my divorce proceedings, but I could see the concern in his eyes when I explained why I was there. "Amanda," he said slowly, settling back in his chair and pulling out a thick file with my name on it. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. David is living in the house on Elmwood Drive with his new wife and your children, but the deed is still in your name." I nodded, and he started flipping through documents with the methodical patience that had made me trust him in the first place. After several minutes, he looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Well," he said, "this is certainly an unusual situation. Legally speaking, David is a tenant in your house. The mortgage payments he's been making could be considered rent, which means you've been his landlord for the past 2 years without realizing it." The words hung in the air between us while I tried to process what he was telling me. Landlord. David, who had lived in that house for over a decade, who had installed the kitchen cabinets and painted the garage and knew exactly which floorboard creaked in the hallway, was legally just renting from me. What does that mean practically? Marcus leaned forward, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked almost amused. "It means, Amanda, that you have significantly more power in this situation than your ex-husband realized. And if he's moved someone else into your property without your permission, we might have grounds for a very interesting conversation about lease violations." I left Marcus's office with a stack of documents to review and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the end of the week. The drive back to my loft felt different somehow, like I was seeing the city through new eyes. For 2 years I'd been the one adapting, adjusting, making compromises to keep everyone else comfortable. I'd moved out of my house, downsized my life, and stepped back to make room for David's new relationship, all while telling myself it was the mature thing to do. But maturity, I was beginning to realize, didn't have to mean accepting everything that happened to me. Sometimes it meant standing up for what was rightfully mine. That evening, I sat in my small kitchen with Tyler and Sophie's latest school photos, propped against the salt shaker, eating takeout Thai food and thinking about the bedrooms they'd shown me in their video. In a few hours, they'd be going to sleep in those carefully designed spaces, surrounded by furniture chosen by someone who barely knew them, in a house that legally belonged to me. For the first time since David had asked for the divorce, I felt something that had been missing for so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Control. Not over David, not over Christine, but over my own story, over what happened next. And what happened next was going to surprise everyone. The next few days passed in a haze of research and discovery that made me feel like a detective, uncovering a conspiracy I'd been living inside without knowing it. Marcus had given me homework, and I approached it with the same methodical focus I used to bring to quarterly budget reports at the agency. I spread documents across my dining table, which was really just a small round table meant for two but had become my command center for rebuilding my life. The mortgage documents told a story I'd never bothered to read carefully before. Every payment David had made over the past 2 years had been processed as a standard mortgage payment to the bank, with my name listed as the sole borrower and property owner. There was no record of him having any legal claim to the property beyond his divorce settlement, which had specifically stated that he would receive assets equivalent to his share of the home's equity rather than ownership rights to the house itself. What became increasingly clear as I worked through the paperwork was that David had been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of our arrangement. In his mind, paying the mortgage meant he was maintaining his right to live in the house. In legal reality, he'd been paying rent to live in a property owned by his ex-wife, and now he'd moved his new wife into that same property without the landlord's permission. I called my friend Rachel Kim, who'd been working in real estate for almost 15 years and had helped me find my current loft. Rachel was one of those people who could explain complex legal concepts in terms that made sense, and she had a talent for seeing angles that other people missed. When I explained the situation, the long pause on her end told me she was processing the implications. "Amanda," she said finally, "this is either going to be the most expensive mistake your ex-husband has ever made, or the most valuable lesson Christine Parker has ever received, possibly both." We met for coffee the next morning at Cedar Grove Cafe, a quiet place in the Alberta district where the owner knew Rachel well enough to give us a corner table where we could spread out documents without curious glances from other customers. Rachel arrived with a legal pad covered in notes and questions, her dark hair pulled back in the no-nonsense ponytail she wore when she was in full professional mode. "I've been thinking about this all night," she said before I'd even finished ordering. "There are several ways you could handle this situation, but first we need to understand exactly what's happening in that house. Are they just living there, or are they making permanent changes?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos Tyler and Sophie had sent over the past few days. Christine had been documenting their move on social media with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never had to worry about property law. There were pictures of painting supplies in the garage, new furniture being delivered, and what looked like construction work happening in the basement. Rachel's eyebrows rose as she scrolled through the images. "Amanda, they're not just living in your house, they're renovating it, without your permission. As the property owner, you have grounds to stop this immediately, and you could potentially hold them liable for any changes made without your written consent." The weight of what she was saying settled over me like a blanket I hadn't realized I needed. For months I'd been watching David build his new life, and feeling like I had no say in how it affected our children or my own sense of home. Now it turned out that I'd had the power to influence that situation all along. I just hadn't known it existed. "What's my next step?" I asked. Rachel leaned back in her chair, and I could see her mind working through possibilities. "Legally, you could serve them with notice to vacate, give them 30 days to move out, and if they refuse, you could begin eviction proceedings. But honestly, that feels like the nuclear option, and it would probably make co-parenting with David extremely difficult." She was right. Of course, whatever satisfaction I might get from forcing David and Christine out of the house would be overshadowed by the impact on Tyler and Sophie. They'd just gotten settled in their newly decorated rooms, and their father would never forgive me for what he'd see as vindictive cruelty. "What's the non-nuclear option?" I asked. "You could approach this as a business transaction," Rachel suggested. "They want to live in your house, you own the house. Instead of letting them squat there indefinitely, you formalize the arrangement. Draw up a proper lease agreement, charge them fair market rent, and maintain your rights as the property owner. If they want to make changes, they get your written permission first." The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of being the bitter ex-wife who pulled the rug out from under David's new marriage, I could be the reasonable landlord who simply wanted a proper legal arrangement. It would give me control over what happened to my property while providing David and Christine with the stability they clearly wanted. But there was something else brewing in the back of my mind, a possibility that Rachel's words had awakened. Fair market rent for a 4-bedroom house in Maple Ridge was significantly more than what David had been paying in mortgage costs. If I converted his mortgage payments to rent payments at market rate, I could finally afford to move out of my cramped loft and into a place where Tyler and Sophie could have their own rooms when they stayed with me. How much are we talking about for market rate rent? I asked. Rachel pulled out her phone and started scrolling through rental listings in my neighborhood. After a few minutes, she looked up with a number that made my coffee suddenly taste much better. For a house that size, in that condition, in that neighborhood, you're looking at anywhere from $2,800 to $3,200 a month, and that's before we factor in the improvements they're making, which are likely increasing the property value. David had been paying $1,800 a month toward the mortgage. The difference between that and market rent would be enough to transform my living situation entirely. For the first time since the divorce, I could afford a place large enough for my children to feel at home when they visited me. Over the next 2 days, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in months, planning for a future that felt bigger than just surviving until the next crisis. I looked at rental listings in neighborhoods with good schools, imagining Tyler and Sophie in bedrooms that weren't bunk beds in my living space. I calculated budgets that included family vacations and after-school activities, and all the things I'd been putting off because there simply wasn't room in my finances or my tiny apartment. But first I needed to understand exactly what David and Christine thought they were doing in my house. I drove to Elmwood Drive on Thursday afternoon, parking across the street where I could observe without being obvious. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had when I'd lived there, tree-lined streets with well-maintained yards and children's bikes left casually in driveway. My house, the pale yellow colonial with the wraparound porch, looked better than it ever had. The yard had been professionally landscaped, the front steps had been repaired and painted, and there were new shutters on all the windows. A contractor's truck was parked in the driveway, and I could see workers carrying materials toward the back of the house. Whatever Christine and David were doing, it was extensive enough to require professional help. I sat in my car for almost an hour, taking notes on everything I observed. 2 different delivery trucks arrived during that time, one dropping off what looked like kitchen appliances, and another delivering furniture wrapped in protective plastic. As I was preparing to leave, Christine emerged from the front door, wearing yoga pants and a paint-splattered t-shirt, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She looked completely at home, directing the contractors with confident gestures, and checking items off a list attached to a clipboard. This wasn't someone who was temporarily staying in someone else's house. This was someone who was claiming territory. When Tyler and Sophie returned from their weekend with David, they were full of stories about the renovation. The basement was being converted into a family room, with a big screen TV and gaming area. The master bathroom was getting a complete renovation with a walk-in shower and a soaking tub. Christine was planning to turn the small bedroom on the first floor into a home office, where she could work when she wasn't at her downtown job. She says we can help pick out paint colors for the family room, Sophie told me as she unpacked her weekend bag. And she's going to teach me how to use the fancy coffee machine she bought for the kitchen. I listened to their enthusiasm and made appropriate encouraging sounds, but inside I was calculating. A basement renovation, bathroom remodel, new appliances, and office conversion easily represented tens of thousands of dollars in improvements to my property. Improvements that Christine and David were making without any legal right to do so, and without any guarantee that they'd be able to stay long enough to enjoy them. That evening, after the kids were asleep, I called Marcus Thompson at home. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear the sound of a television in the background. "Amanda, I was expecting to hear from you. How's your research going?" I summarized what I'd learned over the past few days, describing the renovations, the social media posts, and the clear evidence that David and Christine were treating my house as if they owned it. Marcus listened without interrupting, and I could hear him taking notes. "Well," he said when I finished, "they've certainly made this interesting. The improvements they're making actually strengthen your position significantly. Under Oregon property law, any permanent improvements made to a property by a tenant become the property of the landlord, unless there's a specific agreement stating otherwise." I felt something shift in my chest, a sensation I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like, genuine excitement about my own future. "So you're saying that they're essentially renovating my house for free?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. And given the scope of what you're describing, they're probably adding substantial value to your property, while simultaneously violating the terms of their implied tenancy by making major alterations without the property owner's consent. Marcus suggested that I document everything I could about the renovations before taking any action. He wanted photographs, receipts if I could get them, and a detailed timeline of all the changes they'd made since moving in. Once we had a complete picture of the situation, we could decide on the best approach for protecting my interests while minimizing disruption to the children. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I spent the weekend becoming an amateur private investigator. I drove past the house at different times of day, noting when contractors arrived and what materials they brought. I screenshotted Christine's social media posts before she could delete them, creating a digital record of every improvement they documented. I even called the city permit office to see if they'd filed for any construction permits, which they hadn't, potentially putting them in violation of local building codes as well as our implied landlord-tenant agreement. By Sunday evening, I had a file folder thick with evidence and a clarity about my situation that felt almost overwhelming. David and Christine had been living in my house for 3 months, making major renovations without my permission, posting about their new home on social media, and apparently planning to stay indefinitely. Meanwhile, I'd been living in a space too small for my children and struggling to rebuild my life while they enjoyed the comfort and stability of the home I'd worked for years to afford. The next morning, I met with Marcus in his office to review everything I'd gathered. He spread the photographs across his desk like evidence in a courtroom, occasionally making notes or asking questions about specific details. When he finished reviewing everything, he leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Amanda, I think it's time we had a conversation with your ex-husband about the terms of his tenancy. But before we do that, I want you to think carefully about what outcome you're hoping for here. Do you want them out of the house? Do you want to formalize a rental arrangement? Do you want to sell the property and force them to find somewhere else to live?" It was a question I'd been avoiding, partly because the answer felt too bold to say out loud. But sitting in Marcus's office, surrounded by evidence of my legal rights and my ex-husband's presumptions, I finally felt ready to claim what I wanted. "I want them to pay fair market rent for the privilege of living in my house," I said. "And I want control over any changes they make to my property. If they want to stay, they can stay as my tenants, following my rules and paying me enough that I can afford to give Tyler and Sophie a real home when they're with me." Marcus smiled, the first time I'd seen him look genuinely pleased since I'd walked into his office 3 years ago seeking a divorce attorney. "Now that," he said, "is a reasonable business proposition. Let's see if David finds it as reasonable as we do." The letter Marcus sent to David was a masterpiece of legal clarity wrapped in professional courtesy. It acknowledged David's mortgage payments over the past 2 years while explaining that those payments had established him as a month-to-month tenant of the property. It noted that his new wife's residency in the property without the landlord's consent constituted a lease violation, as did the extensive renovations being performed without written permission from the property owner. The letter offered David 2 options. He could enter into a formal lease agreement at fair market rent with proper tenant protections and landlord approval for any future modifications, or he could provide 30 days' notice and vacate the property. Either way, the current informal arrangement would be ending, and all future interactions regarding the property would be conducted according to Oregon landlord-tenant law. Marcus hand-delivered the letter on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work, deliberately timing it so that David would receive it at his architecture firm rather than at home in front of Christine and the children. The goal was to give him space to process the information and consult with his own attorney before having to explain the situation to his wife. David called me that evening while I was helping Sophie with her reading homework. His voice was tight with anger, but underneath that, I could hear something I hadn't heard from him in years: uncertainty. "Amanda, what the hell is this letter about? Marcus is claiming I'm some kind of tenant in my own house." I had prepared for this conversation, practicing my responses with Rachel over coffee that morning. The key was to stay calm, stick to facts, and resist the temptation to relitigate old grievances from our marriage or divorce. "It's not your house, David. It's my house. It always has been, and the deed is still in my name. I thought you understood that when you agreed to make the mortgage payments as part of our divorce settlement. The silence on his end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke again, and his voice had shifted from anger to something closer to confusion. But I've been paying the mortgage for 2 years. I thought that meant, we've been treating it like it's our place. You've been paying rent, I said gently. And now I need to formalize that arrangement. Especially since you've moved Christine in and started renovating without asking my permission. Another long pause. In the background I could hear the sound of his office door closing, and I realized he was probably just learning the full legal implications of the situation for the first time. Look, he said finally, I need to talk to my lawyer and figure out what this means. Can we table this conversation until I understand what's happening? I agreed to give him a week to review his options with legal counsel, but I also made it clear that the current arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. He was living in my house with his wife, making changes to my property, and treating it like he owned it. That needed to stop, one way or another. After I hung up, I sat at my small kitchen table staring at Sophie's reading workbook, trying to process the conversation I'd just had. For the first time since our divorce, I'd been the one with power in a situation involving David. I'd been the one setting terms, establishing boundaries, and requiring him to respond to my decisions rather than the other way around. It felt strange and slightly terrifying and absolutely exhilarating. Sophie looked up from her book and noticed my expression. Mom, are you okay? You look weird. I smiled at her, this amazing little person, who'd been adapting to adult decisions and changes with more grace than most grown-ups I knew. I'm more than okay, sweetheart. I think things are about to get much better for us, and for the first time in months, I actually believed that was true. The week David requested to consult with his attorney stretched into 10 days, and I used every one of them to prepare for whatever conversation was coming. Rachel had connected me with a property management company that specialized in single-family rental, and I spent hours learning about landlord responsibilities, tenant rights, and the dozens of legal requirements I'd never considered when I was simply a homeowner married to someone who lived there too. What I discovered was both empowering and slightly overwhelming. As a landlord, I had significant control over my property, but I also had obligations that could create legal problems if I didn't handle them correctly. I needed to understand fair housing laws, security deposit requirements, maintenance responsibilities, and eviction procedure. It was like learning an entirely new language, one where every word had legal implications that could protect me or destroy me depending on how carefully I used them. The property management company, Portland Residential Solutions, offered to handle the transition for a percentage of the monthly rent. Their representative, a calm woman named Victoria Santos, who'd been managing rental properties for over a decade, walked me through their standard lease agreement and explained how they typically handled unusual situations. I've seen this before, Victoria told me during our consultation in her office near Powell Boulevard. Not exactly this situation, but similar cases where family relationships and property ownership get tangled up after divorce. The key is to separate the personal dynamics from the business transaction. You're not doing this to hurt your ex-husband or his wife. You're doing it to protect your investment and formalize an arrangement that should have been formalized years ago. Victoria's perspective helped me frame the situation in terms that felt reasonable and professional rather than vindictive. I wasn't being cruel to David and Christine. I was being responsible about my largest financial asset. The fact that they'd been living there informally for months without a proper lease agreement was actually problematic for everyone involved, because it left both parties without clear protections under landlord-tenant law. During those 10 days, I also started seriously looking at apartments that would give Tyler and Sophie real bedrooms when they stayed with me. The rental income from the Elmwood house, if David agreed to fair market terms, would increase my housing budget by almost $1,000 a month. That was the difference between the cramped loft where I'd been surviving and a place where my children and I could actually thrive. I found a duplex in the Beaumont, Wilshire neighborhood, just 15 minutes from their school, and close to the park where Tyler played Little League. It had 3 bedrooms, a small yard and a kitchen large enough for all of us to sit around the table for dinner. The rent was within my new budget, and the landlord was willing to hold it for me if I could provide a deposit within 30 days. For the first time since my divorce, I was making decisions, based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford or what would cause the least disruption for everyone else. It was terrifying and exciting in equal measure. Tyler and Sophie returned from another weekend with David and Christine, full of updates about the ongoing renovations. The basement family room was nearly finished, complete with a sectional sofa large enough for all four of them to watch movies together. Christine had installed a coffee bar in the kitchen with an expensive espresso machine and matching cups that looked like they belonged in a boutique cafe. They'd also started talking about getting a dog, something about how Charlie needed a friend, and how nice it would be to have pets in their new home. Their new home, the phrase stuck in my mind long after Sophie had finished showing me photos on David's phone. To Tyler and Sophie, the house on Elmwood was becoming home in a way it had never been during the final years of my marriage to David. They had their own spaces, decorated the way they wanted them. They had stability, routine, and two adults who seemed genuinely happy to be building a life together. The irony wasn't lost on me that David and Christine were creating the family environment in my house that David and I had never quite managed to achieve when we actually lived there together. But instead of feeling bitter about that, I found myself oddly grateful. My children deserved to see what a healthy relationship looked like, even if it meant watching their father build that relationship with someone else in the house where I used to live. On Friday evening, exactly 10 days after Marcus had delivered the letter, David called. His voice was different than it had been during our previous conversation, more measured and less defensive. He'd clearly spent time processing the situation and consulting with legal counsel. "Amanda, I need to apologize. My lawyer explained the deed situation to me, and I realize I made some assumptions about our arrangement that weren't based on the actual legal facts. I honestly thought that paying the mortgage meant I had some kind of ownership stake that survived the divorce settlement." It was perhaps the most straightforward acknowledgement of a mistake I'd ever heard from David, and it caught me off guard. During our marriage, he'd had a tendency to justify his decisions rather than admit when he'd been wrong, a trait that had contributed to many of our arguments. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "What are you thinking about how we move forward?" David took a deep breath that I could hear through the phone. "Christine and I would like to stay in the house if we can work out terms that make sense for everyone. We've put a lot of work into it, and the kids are settled there, but I understand now that we need a formal lease agreement, and I realize the mortgage payments I've been making probably don't reflect what you could get for rent on the open market." This was the conversation I'd been preparing for, but hearing David approach it reasonably made it easier than I'd expected. We talked for almost an hour, covering the practical details of converting his mortgage obligation into a rental arrangement. He accepted that fair market rent was higher than what he'd been paying, and he understood that any future renovations would require my written approval, as the property owner. The one point where we hit resistance was the timeline. David asked for 90 days to adjust to the new rental amount, citing the money they'd already spent on renovations and Christine's desire to finish a few projects they'd started. I was sympathetic to their financial concerns, but I also knew that dragging out the transition would only make it more complicated. 60 days, I offered. 2 months to adjust your budget and finish whatever projects are already in progress. After that, we go to full market rent and a formal lease agreement with proper approval processes for any changes to the property. David agreed, and we scheduled a meeting for the following week to review the lease terms Victoria's company had prepared. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my hands weren't shaking and my heart wasn't racing. The conversation I'd been dreading for 2 weeks had been challenging but not combative. David had been reasonable, even apologetic, and we'd found a path forward that protected my interests while allowing his family to stay settled. The meeting at Victoria's office the following Tuesday was surprisingly professional. David arrived with Christine, both of them dressed like they were attending a business meeting rather than a family negotiation. Christine was quieter than I'd expected, letting David handle most of the conversation while she took notes and asked occasional questions about maintenance responsibilities and pet policy. Victoria walked us through the lease agreement section by section, explaining each clause and making sure everyone understood their rights and obligations. The rent would start at the reduced amount we'd agreed on for the first 60 days, then increase to full market rate. David and Christine would be responsible for utilities, basic maintenance, and keeping the property in good condition. She was exactly the kind of landlord I hoped to become for David and Christine. Someone who treated her property as a business investment while recognizing that it was also someone's home. She walked me through the quirks of the house, showing me which faucet needed gentle handling and where the circuit breaker was located, treating me like a partner in maintaining the property rather than just someone who sent monthly rent checks. The hardest part of the move was setting up Tyler and Sophie's rooms without them there to see the process. I'd bought them each a new comforter set and asked them to choose their favorite colors when we'd visited the week before. Tyler had selected navy blue with silver accents, very sophisticated for a 12-year-old, while Sophie had chosen lavender with white stars that would glow softly in the dark. As I arranged their belongings in their individual spaces, rooms that were actually large enough for desks and bookshelves and all the accumulations of childhood, I felt something close to grief for all the years we'd spent cramped together in spaces too small for our needs. Not grief for my marriage, which had needed to end, but grief for the time Tyler and Sophie had spent adapting to diminished circumstances because of adult decisions they'd had no part in making. Rachel found me sitting on the floor of Sophie's room, surrounded by books I was organizing on her new bookshelf, with tears running down my face. "Hey," she said softly, settling down beside me. "What's going on?" I gestured around the room, with its large windows and reading corner and space for Sophie to spread out art projects without having to clear them away for dinner. "They're going to have their own rooms," I said, as if this was a revolutionary concept rather than something most children took for granted. Rachel nodded, understanding immediately what I was really saying. "You did this, Amanda. You figured out how to give them this." She was right, of course. The rental income from the Elmwood house was what made this duplex possible, and the rental income existed because I'd finally claimed my legal rights as the property owner. For 2 years I'd been letting David live in my house for less than market rent, while I struggled to afford adequate housing for my children when they stayed with me. The correction of that arrangement had created the resources I needed to provide them with something better. By evening, the duplex was starting to feel like home. We'd hung pictures, arranged furniture, and filled the refrigerator with groceries that could feed a family rather than just sustaining 2 adults who ate most of their meals standing at a counter. Elena had stayed for dinner, and the 3 of us sat around my new dining table, eating takeout Chinese food and planning where to put the last few boxes. "You know what's different about you," Elena said as we were cleaning up. "You look like someone who knows what she's doing. For the first time since I've known you, you look like you're driving rather than just holding on." I thought about that observation as I fell asleep in my new bedroom that night, in a space large enough for a real bed, and a dresser, and even a small chair by the window where I could sit and read. Elena was right that something fundamental had shifted in how I moved through the world. I was making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what I could tolerate, and that change was evident in everything from the furniture I'd chosen to the way I'd negotiated the lease terms with David and Christine. Tyler and Sophie's first night in the duplex was everything I'd hoped it would be. They raced through their new rooms, testing the acoustics and the sightlines, and the storage possibilities. Sophie immediately claimed the reading corner and arranged her favorite books within easy reach. Tyler spent an hour adjusting his desk and organizing his basketball cards in the new display case I'd bought him, but the real test came on Sunday morning when they woke up in their own rooms and came downstairs for breakfast. Instead of the cramped choreography we'd perfected in the loft where everyone had to coordinate movements to avoid collisions, we had space to spread out. Tyler could eat his cereal while reading a book at the counter. Sophie could work on a coloring project at the dining table while I made coffee and checked emails on my laptop. "Mom," Sophie said, looking up from her art supplies, "this feels like a real house." It was such a simple observation, but it captured something I'd been struggling to articulate. The loft had been shelter, a place to sleep and eat and store our belongings. This duplex was a home, a place where we could each have individual space while still being together as a family. The first month in the new place established rhythms that felt sustainable in a way our previous arrangements never had. Tyler and Sophie could invite friends over without having to apologize for the lack of space. I could work from home when needed, without commandeering the only table we had for eating. We could host Elena for dinner without asking her to sit on the couch, because we didn't have enough chairs. More importantly, The kids seemed to relax in a way they hadn't been able to in the law. They'd been cooperative and adaptable during our years of reduced circumstances, never complaining about sharing a bedroom or doing homework on the coffee table. But now that they had space to spread out, I realized how much they'd been constraining themselves to accommodate our limitations. The rental arrangement with David and Christine was proceeding smoothly, with monthly payments arriving on time and proper communication about any maintenance issues that arose. Christine had sent me detailed plans for the bathroom renovation they wanted to complete, along with estimates from licensed contractors and evidence that they'd obtained the necessary permit. It was exactly the kind of professional communication I'd hoped for, treating me as the property owner while acknowledging that this was their home. In December, Christine called me directly for the first time since we'd signed the lease agreement. She was calling about the landscaping project they'd proposed, but the conversation quickly expanded into something more personal. "Amanda, I wanted to thank you for how you've handled this whole situation," she said. "I know it could have been much more complicated and adversarial than it's been." I was folding laundry in my bedroom while we talked, a domestic task that had become almost meditative in the spacious quiet of the duplex. I didn't see any benefit in making it more difficult than it needed to be. I said, "You and David are taking good care of the house, and the kids are happy with the arrangement." Christine was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was more tentative. "Can I ask you something personal? Did you know all along that the deed was in your name, or was it something you discovered after we moved in?" It was a fair question, and I appreciated that she'd asked it directly rather than speculating or assuming. I knew the deed was in my name, but I hadn't really thought through the implications of that until I saw the photos Tyler and Sophie were sending me of their renovated room. It made me realize that you and David were making permanent changes to my property without my permission, and that didn't feel sustainable. "I understand," Christine said. "And honestly, I'm glad you said something when you did. David and I had been operating under some assumptions that probably weren't fair to you." What struck me about this conversation was how reasonable Christine sounded, how willing she was to acknowledge that the situation had been more complex than either she or David had initially understood. It made me think that perhaps the three of us could find a way to coexist in this arrangement that worked for everyone involved. "How are things going with the house?" I asked. "Are you and David happy with how everything's turned out?" Christine's voice brightened noticeably. "We love it. The basement renovation turned out even better than we hoped, and the kids spend so much time down there. Tyler's been teaching me to play video games, which I'm terrible at, but he's very patient with me." She paused, and I could hear the smile in her voice when she continued. "Sophie told me you have a reading corner in your new place too. She said it has fairy lights and everything." She was very specific about her requirements, I said, laughing. "I think she's planning to read every book in the Portland library system from that corner. She's such a bright kid." They both are. David and I feel really lucky to be part of their lives. It was exactly the kind of sentiment I'd hoped to hear from someone who was helping to raise my children, and it reinforced my sense that I'd made the right decision in formalizing our rental arrangement, rather than forcing them to move out. The conversation ended with Christine promising to send me the final landscaping proposals by the end of the week, but it continued to resonate with me for days afterward. For the first time since David had remarried, I felt like Christine and I were communicating as two adults who both cared about Tyler and Sophie's well-being, rather than as the current wife and the ex-wife navigating some complicated emotional territory. 2 weeks before Christmas, David called to discuss holiday arrangements. The kids would spend Christmas Eve with me, and Christmas Day with him and Christine, which had been our pattern for the past 2 years. But this year he had an additional request. "Christine's parents are coming to visit for the holidays," he said, "and they're really looking forward to meeting Tyler and Sophie. We were wondering if you'd be comfortable with them giving the kids Christmas presents." It was a thoughtful question, acknowledging that expanding the children's extended family network was something that affected me as well as them. During my marriage to David, his parents had been the kids' only grandparents, since my own parents had died before Tyler was born. The possibility of Christine's parents becoming additional grandparent figures was actually appealing, especially if they were people who would love and support my children. "That sounds wonderful," I said. Tyler and Sophie can never have too many people who care about them. David's relief was audible.
Thank you.
I know this whole situation has been an adjustment for everyone, but I really appreciate how you've approached it. It occurred to me that David and I were communicating better as divorced co-parents and landlord-tenant than we ever had as married homeowners. Perhaps the clear legal boundaries and defined responsibilities made it easier for us to treat each other with respect and consideration. Christmas morning with Tyler and Sophie was everything I'd hoped it would be in our new home. They came downstairs to presents arranged under the small tree we'd decorated together, and we spent the morning in our pajamas, opening gifts and eating the cinnamon rolls I'd prepared the night before. The living room was large enough for them to spread out their new belongings, without having to immediately clean up to make space for other activities. Tyler had asked for a desk lamp for his room, and a new basketball hoop for the backyard. Practical gifts that reflected how settled he felt in our new space. Sophie wanted art supplies and books, both of which she could now store properly in her own room rather than in boxes under someone else's bed. As I watched them playing with their new gifts in our living room, with winter sunlight streaming through windows that belonged to us for as long as we wanted to stay, I realized that this was the Christmas morning I'd been trying to create for years. Not because of the presents or the bigger space, but because of the sense of permanence and security that made everything else possible. When David picked them up that afternoon to take them to Christmas dinner with Christine and her visiting parents, Tyler and Sophie were excited to show him their new rooms and tell him about the Christmas morning we'd had together. There was no tension in the transition, no sense that they were leaving one life to participate in another incompatible one. They were simply moving between two homes where they were loved and welcome. After they left, I spent the evening reading in Sophie's abandoned reading corner, surrounded by fairy lights and the quiet satisfaction of a day that had unfolded exactly as I'd hoped it would. For the first time since my divorce, Christmas felt like a celebration rather than an endurance test, and I knew that the children had experienced something similar. The rental income from the Elmwood house had made this Christmas possible, but more than that, it had made this life possible. The life where Tyler and Sophie had their own rooms, and I had space to breathe, and we could all expand into our full selves, rather than constantly accommodating limitations we'd had no part in creating. As I turned off the fairy lights and headed to my own bedroom, I reflected on how completely my circumstances had changed in just a few months. I'd gone from being someone who accepted whatever arrangements other people made, to someone who created the arrangements that worked for my family. I'd gone from surviving to planning, from adapting to choosing, from feeling powerless to understanding exactly where my power lay and how to use it responsibly. The woman who'd sat in Marcus Thompson's office 6 months ago, confused and hurt by David's presumptions about the house, felt like a different person than the one who was now falling asleep in a home she'd chosen and furnished and filled with the life she wanted to create for herself and her children. Tomorrow, the kids would come back with stories about Christmas dinner with Christine's parents and the presents they'd received, and all the ways their extended family continued to grow and evolve. And I would listen to those stories with genuine happiness for them, secure in the knowledge that their expanded family network was built on a foundation that protected my interests as well as theirs. It had taken me longer than I'd expected to understand that protecting my own interests and caring for my children's well-being weren't contradictory goals. In fact, they were inseparable. The security and stability I'd created for myself had made it possible for me to support their relationships with David and Christine from a position of strength rather than desperation. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to what came next. 6 months later, I stood in the backyard of the duplex watching Tyler practice basketball shots against the hoop we'd installed in February, while Sophie read under the cherry tree that was now in full bloom. The evening air carried the scent of barbecues and blooming flowers, the kind of spring evening that makes you grateful to live in Portland despite the months of rain that preceded it. My phone buzzed with a text from Christine, a photo of the completed bathroom renovation at the Elmwood house. The transformation was stunning, exactly the kind of high-end finish that would significantly increase the property's value. She'd included a note thanking me for approving the project and mentioning that the contractors had complimented the quality of the original construction. It struck me how routine these communications had become. Christine sent me photos of completed projects, David forwarded estimates for maintenance work that needed approval, and I responded with appreciation for their care of the property. We'd found a rhythm that felt professional without being cold, respectful without being distant. The rental arrangement had exceeded every expectation I'd had when Marcus first explained my legal position. David and Christine were model tenants who treated the house as if they owned it while respecting my role as the property owner. They'd increased its value through thoughtful improvements, maintained it impeccably, and created a stable environment where Tyler and Sophie could thrive during their time there. More importantly, the rental income had transformed my financial situation in ways I was still discovering. I'd been able to start a college fund for both children, something that had seemed impossible during the years when I was choosing between car repairs and groceries. I'd also begun contributing to a retirement account for the first time since my divorce, building security for a future that finally felt possible to plan for. But the real transformation had been more subtle and more profound than improved finance. I'd learned to think of myself as someone whose decisions mattered, whose boundaries deserved respect, and whose needs were worth protecting. The woman who'd passively accepted David's assumption that he could live in her house indefinitely felt like someone I'd known in another lifetime. Tyler jogged over to where I was sitting on the back steps, basketball tucked under his arm and face flushed from exercise. At 13, he was beginning to look more like a young man than a child, and I could see hints of the adult he was becoming in his thoughtful expressions and growing independence. "Mom, can I ask you something?" He settled beside me on the steps, suddenly serious in the way that meant he'd been thinking about something important. "Always," I said, giving him my full attention. "Dad and Christine have been talking about maybe buying the house from me. Not right away, but maybe in a few years when they have more money saved up. What do you think about that?" It was a question I'd been expecting, though not necessarily from Tyler. The house had appreciated significantly since David and Christine had moved in, both because of their improvements, and because the Maple Ridge neighborhood continued to grow in popularity. Selling it to them eventually would provide me with a substantial profit that could fund Tyler and Sophie's college educations, or allow me to buy my own place. "What would you think about that?" I asked. "It's your opinion that matters most to me." Tyler considered this carefully, bouncing the basketball gently against the step while he thought, "I think it would be good for them, and it would be good for us too. They love that house. And you love this house. Everyone would get to keep the place that feels like home to them." His insight was remarkable for someone his age, but Tyler had been forced to think about adult complexities earlier than most children. The divorce, the housing transitions, and the family dynamics he'd navigated had given him a perspective that was both wise and practical. "I think you're right," I said. "When they're ready to make an offer, I'll definitely consider it seriously." Sophie had abandoned her book and wandered over to join our conversation, settling cross-legged on the grass with dandelions in her hair. At 10, she was still young enough to believe that most problems had simple solutions, but old enough to understand that family arrangements could be complicated. "Are we going to live here forever?" she asked, plucking petals from a dandelion with the careful concentration she brought to everything. "As long as we're happy here," I said. "What do you think about that?" Sophie smiled, the kind of unguarded expression that reminded me why all the legal complications and financial arrangements mattered. "I like it here. It feels like ours." That phrase, "it feels like ours," captured something essential about what I'd been trying to create for the past year. Not just adequate housing or financial stability, but the sense of ownership and permanence that comes from making choices rather than accepting circumstances. The next week, David called to schedule a time when he and Christine could discuss their long-term plans for the house. We met at a coffee shop in the Alberta district, the kind of neutral territory that had become comfortable for us over the months of managing our business relationship. David looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in years, the kind of contentment that comes from building something sustainable with someone you love. Christine was glowing with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd found her place in the world and was confident about protecting it. "We know it's early to be having this conversation," David began, "but we wanted you to know that we're interested in purchasing the house when our financial situation allows for it, probably in 2 or 3 years, when we've saved enough for a down payment that would make sense for everyone." Christine leaned forward, her expression earnest. "We've talked to a real estate agent about what the house would be worth in today's market, and we understand that you'd be giving up a significant asset. We want to make sure any offer we make reflects that value. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful approach I'd hoped for, acknowledging both their desire to own the home they'd invested in, and my right to fair compensation for an asset that had appreciated substantially under their care. I think that could work well for everyone, I said. The rental income has served its purpose in helping me get established in my new place, but I can see the benefits of converting that arrangement to a sale when you're ready. We spent an hour discussing timelines, market conditions, and the process we'd use to determine fair value when the time came. It felt like planning for a future that would benefit everyone involved rather than negotiating a transaction where someone had to lose for others to win. As we prepared to leave, Christine touched my arm gently. "Amanda, I want you to know how grateful I am for the way you've handled all of this. You could have made our lives much more difficult, and instead you've made it possible for us to build something stable and beautiful." Her words carried a weight that went beyond the practical arrangements we'd discussed. She was acknowledging that I'd had power in this situation that I could have used destructively, and that my choice to use it constructively had shaped all of our lives in positive ways. "We're all responsible for making this work," I said. "You and David have been wonderful tenants and wonderful partners in raising Tyler and Sophie. I couldn't have asked for a better outcome." As I drove home that afternoon, I reflected on how completely my relationship with David had transformed over the past year. We'd gone from former spouses, trying to navigate an awkward divorce aftermath, to business partners managing a successful arrangement that benefited everyone involved. The clarity of our legal relationship had created space for respect and cooperation that had been impossible when everything was undefined and assumed. But more than that, I'd discovered something about myself that I hadn't known was there. I was capable of protecting my interests without damaging other people's well-being. I could assert my rights without being vindictive. I could demand fair treatment without abandoning compassion. The woman who'd sat in her car outside the Elmwood house 8 months ago, feeling like her entire past had been stolen from her, had been operating from a position of powerlessness that was largely self-imposed. The deed to that house had always been in my name. The legal rights had always existed. What I'd lacked was the confidence to claim them, and the wisdom to use them constructively. That evening, as I helped Sophie hang fairy lights in the garden, and listened to Tyler practice piano in his room, I understood that I'd built something more valuable than just a stable housing situation or a reliable income stream. I'd built a life where my decisions shaped our circumstances, where my children could depend on my ability to protect and provide for them, and where I could look toward the future with confidence rather than anxiety. The house on Elmwood Drive would always be part of our story, the place where Tyler and Sophie had spent their early years, and where David and I had tried to build a marriage that ultimately couldn't survive our differences. But it wasn't home anymore, and I was finally at peace with that truth. Home was wherever my children and I created safety and love, and possibility together. Home was the reading corner where Sophie disappeared into other worlds, and the backyard where Tyler practiced his dreams of basketball start. Home was the kitchen where we ate breakfast together on school mornings, and the living room where we watched movies on Sunday afternoons. Home was wherever I remembered that I had the power to shape our story, and the wisdom to use that power. 2 years from now, David and Christine would probably buy the house where my children had learned to walk and talk and dream. They'd continue the improvements they'd started, adding value and beauty to a property I'd owned, but they'd transformed into their vision of home. Tyler and Sophie would have 2 stable households that reflected the love and care of the adults who'd learned to work together for their benefit, and I would have the resources to buy my own place, something chosen and designed entirely around the life I wanted to create for my family. Something that belonged to us not because of divorce settlements or legal technicalities, but because we'd earned it, and chosen it, and made it out. Looking back, I realized that David, moving Christine into my house without asking permission, had been the best thing that could have happened to any of us. It had forced me to claim rights I'd forgotten I had, to demand respect I deserved, and to build a life based on my own choices, rather than other people's assumptions. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as problems that require us to discover strengths we didn't know we possessed. Sometimes finding your power means learning that you had it all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.